Let me tell you about the day my peaceful suburban life turned into a ridiculous courtroom drama worthy of daytime television. It all started with a letter so absurd, so dripping with passive aggression, that I almost framed it as a piece of modern art. But alas, I decided to keep it as evidence instead. The sender? None other than Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, Homeowners Association, whose hobbies include enforcing obscure rules, glaring at children playing on the sidewalk, and single-handedly keeping the complaint department in business. The letter accused me, Jack Miller, a mild-mannered jazz enthusiast, of committing noise pollution. Noise pollution, as if I were hosting underground rave parties or running a chainsaw marathon in my backyard. No, my alleged crime was far more sinister. Playing jazz records at a disturbing volume during the evening hours. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of noise pollution, I picture construction sites or honking traffic jams. Not Miles Davis softly crooning through my living room speakers. Karen's letter was a masterpiece of HOA bureaucracy. It began with a polite "Dear Mr. Miller," and quickly escalated into legalese that made it sound like I was violating the Geneva Conventions. She claimed my music was disrupting the tranquility of the community and causing undue stress to residents. Stress? Really? If anything, my jazz collection should be lowering stress levels. It's practically musical therapy. But Karen wasn't done. She ended her missive with an ominous threat. If I didn't cease and desist immediately, legal action would follow. Naturally, I laughed. Then I laughed some more. And then, because Karen is not someone you ignore, I decided to investigate. Was my music truly bothering anyone? I asked my next-door neighbors, the Johnsons, who are always up for a chat. Mrs. Johnson chuckled and said, "Oh, honey, we can barely hear it over our TV." Mr. Johnson added, "If anything, it's nice background noise while we watch Jeopardy." Encouraged by their support, I asked around the block. Most people hadn't even noticed my music. A few said they enjoyed it. One guy asked if I could recommend some good bebop albums. But Karen was on a crusade. She wasn't just complaining. She was rallying troops. Soon enough, she had convinced 2 other HOA board members to join her cause, turning this into what she called a community-wide issue. Never mind that the community consisted mostly of retirees who couldn't hear much over their own tinnitus. Then came the escalation. Karen filed an official complaint with the HOA board and sent me another letter stating that they were considering fines for my continued disregard for community harmony. Harmony. The irony was almost too much to bear. Here's where things got interesting or infuriating depending on your perspective. Karen wasn't content with HOA fines. She wanted justice served on a silver platter. So she took the matter to court. That's right, court. She filed an actual lawsuit accusing me of violating local noise ordinances and causing emotional distress. Emotional distress from jazz music. At this point, I started wondering if Karen had ever heard of priorities or hobbies. The summons arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning like some sort of melodramatic plot twist in a soap opera. It was official. I was going to court over jazz music. My initial reaction was disbelief. Then came anger. Finally, amusement took over. If Karen wanted to make this ridiculous spectacle public, then so be it. I'd play along. But first, I needed to prepare. Step 1. Gather evidence proving my innocence and her absurdity. I started by measuring the decibel levels in my living room during peak jazz hours using an app on my phone. The results? A modest 40 decibels, about as loud as a quiet conversation or distant bird chirping. Hardly the cacophony Karen had described in her complaint. Step 2. Dig into HOA regulations and local noise ordinances. Turns out Karen hadn't done her homework, or maybe she just didn't care about pesky details like facts. The HOA rules mention nothing about specific decibel limits for music. They only prohibited excessive noise, which was conveniently undefined. As for local laws, they set daytime limits at 70 decibels and nighttime limits at 60 decibels, both far above my harmless 40. Step 3. Uncover Karen's hypocrisy, because let's be honest, there's always hypocrisy. This part was almost too easy. During one particularly quiet evening stroll around the neighborhood, I recorded audio from Karen's backyard, a cacophony of squealing machinery coming from her pool pump system that sounded like it belonged in an industrial factory rather than suburbia. Armed with evidence and righteous indignation, I prepared for battle, or rather, trial. The day finally arrived, my showdown with Karen in court. As I walked into the courtroom wearing my best suit, because appearances matter, I couldn't help but marvel at how surreal this situation had become. There she was, Karen herself, sitting primly at the plaintiff's table with an air of smug superiority that could rival any reality TV villain. Her lawyer began by painting me as some sort of neighborhood menace, a man whose musical tastes were allegedly driving residents to despair and sleepless nights. He described my jazz collection as if it were weaponized noise designed to torment innocent civilians. When it was my turn to speak, I couldn't resist injecting some humor into proceedings, because honestly, how could you not? Your Honor, I began solemnly, I stand accused of crimes against tranquility, but let me assure you, Miles Davis is not guilty. The courtroom erupted in laughter, a small victory against Karen's reign of terror. I presented my evidence methodically, decibel readings proving my music was quieter than most household appliances, testimonials from neighbors who found no issue with it, recordings of Karen's own pool pump system violating every conceivable standard for noise pollution. Karen squirmed uncomfortably as each piece of evidence undermined her case further, and by the time I finished cross-examining her lawyer about vague HOA regulations and unenforceable ordinances, it became clear even to them that this lawsuit had been doomed from day one. In conclusion, justice wasn't just served. It was seasoned perfectly with irony and garnished generously with humor. All thanks to jazz music. When Karen decided to drag me into court over my alleged noise pollution, I knew I had to prepare for battle. This wasn't just about jazz music anymore. It was about principle, dignity, and, frankly, the sheer absurdity of it all. If Karen wanted to play HOA overlord and turn my Miles Davis records into a public enemy, then I was going to fight back with everything I had. And let me tell you, the process of building my case was equal parts ridiculous and enlightening. The first step in my preparation was understanding the so-called rules Karen claimed I was violating. I dusted off the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS. A document so thick and convoluted that it could double as a doorstop. As I flipped through its endless pages of legal jargon, I found rules about lawn height, acceptable mailbox designs, and even restrictions on holiday decorations. Apparently inflatable Santas are considered visual nuisances. But when it came to noise, the language was laughably vague. The CC and RS prohibited excessive noise, but didn't bother to define what excessive meant. Was it louder than a vacuum cleaner? A barking dog? Karen's own voice screeching at HOA meetings? No one knew. To make matters worse or better, depending on your perspective, the CC and RS also required the HOA to use a decibel meter to measure noise complaints. Did Karen have one? Of course not. She was basing her accusations on her own subjective annoyance levels, which seemed to spike whenever she wasn't the center of attention. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to gather some hard evidence of my own. First, I downloaded a decibel meter app on my phone and started measuring the sound levels during my nightly jazz sessions. The results were hilariously underwhelming. 40 decibels, equivalent to a quiet conversation or light rain. Hardly the sonic apocalypse Karen had described in her complaint. For comparison, I measured other noises around the neighborhood. Lawnmowers, 90 decibels. Barking dogs, 80 decibels. Karen's pool pump, an ear-splitting 95 decibels. If anyone was guilty of noise pollution, it wasn't me. It was Karen herself. Next, I decided to collect testimonies from my neighbors. This part was both enlightening and entertaining. Most of them hadn't even noticed my music. A few said they enjoyed it. One elderly neighbor asked if I could play more Duke Ellington because it reminded her of her youth. Then there was Bob, the neighborhood conspiracy theorist, who insisted that Karen's vendetta against me was part of a larger plot to install surveillance cameras on every house. While Bob's theories were questionable at best, his enthusiasm for defending me was oddly reassuring. But the piece de resistance in my evidence-gathering mission came during one particularly quiet evening walk around the neighborhood. As I strolled past Karen's house, I heard it. the unmistakable screeching of her ancient pool pump system, a sound so loud and grating that it could wake the dead. Naturally, I whipped out my phone and recorded it. The irony was delicious. Here was Karen accusing me of disturbing the peace, while her own backyard sounded like a construction site. With my evidence in hand, decibel readings, neighbor testimonies, and recordings of Karen's pool pump, I felt confident about my case. But Karen wasn't done yet. She had her own evidence, which she presented with all the seriousness of someone unveiling classified government documents. Her main piece of evidence? A grainy video recorded from her backyard that allegedly captured the offensive jazz music emanating from my house. The video was laughable. A shaky shot of her garden fence with faint traces of music barely audible in the background. If anything, it proved how quiet my music actually was. But Karen insisted that this video demonstrated clear and undeniable harm to her quality of life. Karen also brought in 2 HOA board members as witnesses, both of whom were clearly roped into this nonsense against their better judgment. One of them mumbled something about community standards while avoiding eye contact. The other admitted under cross-examination that he'd never actually heard my music himself but trusted Karen's judgment because she's very passionate. Passionate indeed. Passionate about making everyone else miserable. As I prepared for court, I couldn't help but marvel at how absurd this situation had become. Here we were, 2 grown adults embroiled in a legal battle over jazz music in suburbia. It felt like something out of a sitcom or one of those bizarre courtroom reality shows where people argue over stolen lawn ornaments. But beneath the humor lay a deeper issue: power dynamics within HOAs and their ability to weaponize vague rules against homeowners who dared to challenge them. Karen wasn't just fighting me over noise. She was asserting her dominance as HOA president, a role she seemed to treat as more important than any elected office in Washington. By the time our court date rolled around, I had assembled a case so airtight that even Perry Mason would have been impressed. My evidence painted a clear picture. Not only was my music harmless by any reasonable standard, but Karen herself was guilty of far greater noise violations than she accused me of committing. And yet, despite all logic and reason, Karen remained defiant, clinging to her crusade like a shipwrecked survivor clutching a piece of driftwood. Her confidence bordered on delusion. She genuinely believed she could win this case based on nothing more than her personal annoyance levels and shaky video footage. As we entered the courtroom for what promised to be an epic showdown between common sense and HOA tyranny, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and amusement. This wasn't just about proving my innocence. It was about exposing the absurdity of Karen's vendetta for all to see. Little did she know that her pool pump recordings were about to steal the show. But that's another story entirely. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation, as if the entire town had shown up to witness the trial of the century. And honestly, who wouldn't? It's not every day you get to see a grown man defend his right to play jazz music against a self-proclaimed HOA dictator. As I walked in, clutching my folder of evidence like it was Excalibur, I couldn't help but notice Karen sitting smugly at the plaintiff's table. She looked like she was preparing for war, or perhaps just another HOA meeting, which for her was basically the same thing. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, called the court to order. She had the kind of demeanor that said she'd seen it all. Land disputes, custody battles, maybe even someone suing their neighbor over a stolen garden gnome. But I had a feeling this case would test even her patience. Karen's lawyer started things off with an opening statement so dramatic it could have been nominated for an Oscar. He described me as a reckless individual who had willfully disrupted the peace of an otherwise harmonious community. He painted my jazz collection as if it were some sort of sonic weapon capable of leveling cities. "This is not just about music," he declared, gesturing wildly at the jury, which consisted of 6 bored locals who clearly wished they were anywhere else. "This is about respect for one's neighbors." I couldn't help but chuckle under my breath. Respect for one's neighbors? This coming from Karen, the woman who once threatened to fine Mrs. Johnson for planting petunias too close to the sidewalk. Then it was my turn. My lawyer, a sharp-witted guy named Dan who looked like he moonlighted as a stand-up comedian, rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he began, "my client stands accused of playing jazz music at a volume so low that most people would need hearing aids to detect it. The plaintiff claims this has caused her emotional distress. We intend to prove that not only is this claim baseless, but that the plaintiff herself is guilty of far greater noise violations. Karen shot Dan a glare so intense I thought lasers might shoot out of her eyes. The evidence phase began with Karen's lawyer presenting her infamous video recording, the one where you could barely hear my music over the sound of crickets chirping in her backyard. He played it on a small TV set up in front of the courtroom, and I swear, everyone leaned forward and squinted as if trying to decipher some hidden message in the static. The judge frowned. "Is this it?" she asked. Karen's lawyer nodded solemnly. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge sighed audibly and rubbed her temples. "I can barely hear anything." Karen leapt to her feet. "That's exactly my point," she exclaimed, waving her arms like she was conducting an orchestra of indignation. "It's subtle but persistent. It gets into your head. It's psychological warfare." Dan leaned over to me and whispered, "Psychological warfare?" She really thinks Miles Davis is out here playing mind games. Next came Karen's witnesses, the 2 HOA board members she'd roped into supporting her crusade. The first one mumbled something about community standards while avoiding eye contact with me entirely. The second admitted under cross-examination that he'd never actually heard my music himself but trusted Karen because she's very passionate about these things. Passionate indeed. Passionate about turning molehills into mountains. Then it was my turn to present my case. Dan started by playing the recordings I'd taken of my nightly jazz sessions, complete with decibel readings proving they were quieter than most household appliances. The courtroom listened intently as soft strains of Miles Davis filled the air like a soothing balm against Karen's hysteria. 40 decibels, Dan announced proudly. About as loud as a whisper or distant bird chirping. Karen scoffed audibly but said nothing. Next came the testimonies from my neighbors, most of whom were more than happy to support me after years of enduring Karen's reign of terror. Mrs. Johnson described my music as pleasant background noise and added that Karen's pool pump was far more disruptive. Bob, the conspiracy theorist, delivered an impassioned speech about HOA corruption that didn't really help my case but was entertaining nonetheless. And then came the piece de resistance, the recording of Karen's pool pump system screeching like a banshee in heat. Dan played it on full volume for maximum effect, and I swear, half the courtroom winced and covered their ears. The judge looked visibly annoyed. One juror muttered something about needing aspirin. "Your Honor," Dan said with a flourish, "this is what real noise pollution sounds like." Karen turned bright red and tried to protest, but Dan cut her off with another bombshell. HOA regulations explicitly required noise complaints to be measured with a decibel meter, a device Karen had never bothered to use despite having access to one through the HOA budget. At this point, even Karen's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. The courtroom drama reached its peak during cross-examination when Dan asked Karen point-blank why she hadn't addressed her own noise violations before targeting me. Her response? A rambling diatribe about community values that didn't actually answer the question. By the time closing arguments rolled around, it was clear which way this case was going. Dan delivered his final statement with all the confidence of someone who knew he'd already won. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about jazz music. It's about fairness and common sense. My client has been unfairly targeted by an individual who has failed to address her own violations while weaponizing vague HOA rules against him." Karen's lawyer tried to salvage what little dignity they had left by arguing that my music still constituted excessive noise, despite all evidence to the contrary. But even he didn't seem convinced by his own argument. As I sat there waiting for the verdict, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we'd come. From passive-aggressive letters to full-blown courtroom theatrics, all over jazz music in suburbia. And honestly, it was worth every second just to see Karen squirm under pressure. But more on that later. The moment of truth had arrived. The judge, who by now looked like she regretted every life choice that had led her to preside over this absurd case, cleared her throat and began to deliver the verdict. Karen sat stiffly at her table, clutching her purse like it contained the last shred of her dignity. I, on the other hand, leaned back in my chair with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just watched his opponent trip over their own shoelaces in slow motion. After reviewing all evidence presented, the judge began. It is clear to this court that Mr. Miller's music does not constitute excessive noise under HOA regulations or local ordinances. Boom. There it was, the sweet sound of victory. I resisted the urge to fist pump right there in the courtroom. The judge continued, furthermore, it is evident that the plaintiff failed to follow proper procedures for filing noise complaints and has herself been responsible for significant noise disturbances within the community. Karen's face turned a shade of red so intense it could have been classified as a fire hazard. She opened her mouth as if to protest but quickly thought better of it. And finally, the judge said, delivering the coup de grace, the HOA will be required to reimburse Mr. Miller for all legal fees incurred during this case. At that moment, I swear I heard angels singing. Not only had I won, but Karen's beloved HOA, the very institution she wielded like a scepter, was now financially liable for her nonsense. It was poetic justice at its finest. As the judge banged her gavel and declared the case closed, Karen stormed out of the courtroom with all the grace of a toddler denied their favorite toy. Her lawyer trailed behind her, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the span of one trial. I stayed behind to shake hands with Dan, my lawyer extraordinaire. You were brilliant, I told him. If I ever get sued over my lawn height or mailbox design, you're my first call. Dan grinned, happy to help. And hey, if Karen ever tries anything again, just blast some Coltrane and let me know. With that, I walked out of the courtroom feeling like a conquering hero returning from battle. The parking lot was buzzing with neighbors who'd come to watch the spectacle unfold. Most of them firmly on Team Jack by now. Mrs. Johnson was waiting for me with a plate of cookies. Congratulations, she said. You really showed her. Bob, the conspiracy theorist, clapped me on the back and muttered something about Karen being part of a secret HOA cabal funded by big pool pump manufacturers. I nodded politely and made a mental note to avoid him at future block parties. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came later that evening when I returned home and saw Karen's house dark and silent. No screeching pool pump, no passive-aggressive glances from her windows. It seemed she'd finally decided to fix her noise problem after being publicly humiliated in court. To celebrate my victory, I decided to throw a barbecue party for the neighborhood, a sort of thanks for not siding with Karen event. The backyard was decked out with fairy lights, folding chairs, and enough food to feed an army. People showed up in droves, bringing side dishes and bottles of wine as if we were celebrating a national holiday. As everyone mingled and laughed, I couldn't resist adding one final touch. My trusty jazz record spinning on full blast through outdoor speakers. Miles Davis filled the air once again, not as noise pollution but as a triumphant anthem of justice served. Turn it up, someone shouted. I obliged, cranking up the volume until even Bob stopped his conspiracy ramblings to nod along to the beat. Karen didn't show up, obviously, but her absence only made the party sweeter. For once, our little community felt united, not by HOA rules or petty complaints but by shared relief that someone had finally stood up to tyranny in its most ridiculous form. As the night wore on and people started heading home, Mrs. Johnson pulled me aside and said with a wink, "You know what they say, revenge is best served with barbecue." I laughed and promised her I'd save some ribs for next time Karen tried anything. And that's how my suburban saga came to an end, or at least this chapter of it. The HOA learned its lesson, for now. Karen retreated into relative silence, for now, and I became something of a local legend. A jazz-loving rebel who dared to take on the HOA overlord and live to tell the tale. So here's my advice. If you ever find yourself accused of crimes against tranquility by someone like Karen, don't back down. Gather your evidence, call your lawyer, and fight for your right to play music, or plant petunias or hang inflatable Santas or whatever ridiculous thing they're trying to stop you from doing. And when you win, throw yourself a barbecue party with extra jazz. Thanks for watching my story. If you enjoyed it, and let's be honest, how could you not? Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had run-ins with your HOA or dealt with your own personal Karen. I'd love to hear your stories.